A look back, Ben Cauley on a plane crash that took the life of Otis Redding and members of the Bar-Kays. Today is the 50th anniversary of the Wisconsin plane crash that took the life of Stax Records great Otis Redding. In 2007, Bob Mehr told the story of Ben Cauley, trumpet player for the Bar-Kays, who was the lone survivor of the crash. Cauley died in 2015. We give Mehr's story encore presentation today. Sometimes, in his sleep, Ben Cauley still hears their cries, the ones of his friends and bandmates. In dreams, he feels the rush of the lake's icy water, the chill of fear, and the helplessness and hurt that followed. When those moments come, alone in the darkness, he tries to think instead of the music they made together. He tries to conjure the sweet sounds of soul and Stax, the things that have sustained him all the years since. To some, Ben Cauley is the answer to a tragic trivia question. The trumpeter was the sole survivor of the plane crash December 10, 1967, outside Madison, Wis, that claimed 8 people, including Stax Records star Otis Redding, and Cauley's Bar-Kays bandmates Philon Jones, Carl Cunningham, Jimmy King and Ronnie Caldwell. But in a greater sense, Cauley is the ultimate survivor, someone who's become the living embodiment of both the triumph and tragedy of the Stax legacy. On the eve of the crash's 40th anniversary, the 60-year-old Cauley sits in his home recording studio in southeast Memphis with 2 of his daughters, Chekita Cauley Campbell and Sharonda Cauley Oliver, talking emotionally and candidly about his remarkable life. "I thank God," says Cauley of his unlikely survival. "He was there to help me." For those inclined to believe in the sheltering hand of a higher power, Ben Cauley is as close to proof as you may ever find. Logic or luck doesn't fully explain how Cauley escaped the plane crash or the waters that nearly consumed him 40 years ago. Nor do they divine how, in later years, after suffering a massive stroke, when none of his doctors thought he would live for more than a few days, Cauley was soon up and playing his horn. Ben is a miracle, says his friend and fellow Stax Records alum, songwriter, producer David Porter. It's really that simple. Porter marvels not just at Cauley's resilience, but at how he continues to play and perform with the same exuberance and joy he exhibited on the Bar-Kays' delirious debut, the immortal Soul Finger. When you consider what was experienced and yet he can still get up and have a kind of energy that entertains people, says Porter, it's a true testament to what's inside of this guy. Ben is a trooper, adds his Bar-Kays bandmate James Alexander, who missed the ill-fated Redding flight. As a guy, almost like a cat, he has 9 lives. Has had some terrible, traumatic experiences throughout his life. But has always been the same Ben, hitting them high notes like he always does. Like so many Stax stories, Ben Cauley's tale begins in South Memphis. Born in 1947, Cauley's musical grounding came as a child at the New Friendship Baptist Church, wherein he and his mother sang in the choir. Cauley first picked up trumpet in the 7th grade and soon fell in with a group of neighborhood kids in Booker T. Washington High School students, including guitarist Jimmy King, saxophonist Philon Jones, drummer Carl Cunningham, guitarist Jimmy King, keyboardist Ronnie Caldwell, and bassist James Alexander. They formed a group called the Imperials, later changing their name to the Bar-Kays. Cauley, who was a couple of years older than his bandmates, began attending Le Moyne College in 1965. At the same time, the mostly underage band became a favorite at late-night clubs like the Hippodrome, adding their flashy step and dance moves into a repertoire of R&B songs. Released in the spring of '67, the group's debut single for Stax, Soul Finger, would reach number 3 on the Billboard R&B charts. Before long, the young Bar-Kays, most of them still in high school, were a hit act, and being groomed to become Stax's second house band alongside Booker T. It was around this same period that Stax's signature star, Otis Redding, caught the Bar-Kays in concert, and was taken by their sound. After our show he ran backstage, and said "Y'all bad," recalls Cauley. He asked about us doing some gigs. And we said we're still in school, so we can't go on weekdays. He said, "I'll take care of that, I'll pick you up in my plane on Fridays." That summer of '67, the Bar-Kays started their work backing Redding with a 10-night stand at the Apollo Theater in Harlem, and then proceeded to tour the country. The young, energetic Bar-Kays and the tireless Redding proved the perfect musical fit. It was a match made in heaven, says Cauley. That fall, Redding paused from the road to have some polyps removed from his throat, and to write and record what would prove to be his swan song, "Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay." In early December, Redding and the Bar-Kays were back out on the road, doing weekenders at colleges. They had 3 gigs booked between December 8th and 10th, 1967, and most of the entourage was traveling on Redding's new twin-engine Beechcraft. The first job we did that weekend was in Nashville, at Vanderbilt University on Friday, says Cauley. That next night was in Cleveland, Ohio. We filmed the TV show, Upbeat, and then played a concert. The next morning we got up real early to go to the airport, on the way to Madison. Bar-Kays bassist James Alexander had volunteered to return the band's rental car in Cleveland and hop a commercial flight to Wisconsin, dropped them off at the hangar. Cauley remembers the cabin of the plane was especially cold that morning. Carl Cunningham asked an attendant at the airport to crank up the plane so the cabin could warm up, says Cauley. But the attendant told us he couldn't crank it up because the battery was kind of low. He said he'd rather have the pilot do it. We kinda looked at each other, as young fellows do, and said, "The battery's low? Like, what's going on?" 5 minutes after that, it got started, but we were still thinking about that. But we took off going to Madison with no problems. Flying on little rest from the previous night, the passengers soon drifted off to sleep. At around 3:30 p.m., just a few minutes outside of Madison, Cauley woke to the plane's violent shaking. What happened next, Cauley says, is something I can never erase. He recalls turning toward Philon Jones. Philon looked out the window. What he saw, I don't know, but he just said, "Oh no." I remember I got up, unbuckled my seatbelt to see what it was. The next thing I remember, I came to and was in all this water. The plane had gone into Lake Monona, on the banks of Madison, at a sharp 35-degree angle. Cauley was separated from the plane and thrown out of an opening in the fuselage. But surviving the impact of the crash was only the first hurdle. Cauley had never learned to swim, was now struggling in the waters of the frigid lake. Somehow, in between blacking out and rising to the surface of the water, he got hold of a seat cushion, which was keeping him afloat. Amid the waves, he lost hold of the cushion, but then another cushion floated by and he grabbed onto it. In the chaos, confusion and cold, he glimpsed some of his fellow passengers. Carl Cunningham surfaced for a moment without speaking. Ronnie Caldwell cried out for help. Cauley urged him to hold on, but his attempts to get to his bandmates were defeated by the hard, lapping waters. I saw Carl come out of the water. I saw Redding's valet, Matt Kelly, come up on the other side. I was conscious at that time, says Cauley. I didn't know it, but my head was swollen and bleeding, and I remember I had only one shoe. At this tiny detail, Cauley suddenly stops his narrative and drops his head. After a long silence, tears begin streaming down his face, and his body slumps, the weight of 40 years of pain bearing down on his shoulders. His daughter Chekita consoles him. His younger girl Sharonda brings him some tissues, as he struggles to continue. The speed of the rescue team, which got to the crash site in 17 minutes, was probably the thing that saved Cauley. His body was perhaps a couple minutes away from going into hypothermia when he was pulled from the waters. The cause of the crash was never clearly determined. Cauley had escaped with relatively minor cuts on his head and his foot. The others, including Redding and pilot Richard Fraser, had not been so fortunate. Taken to the hospital, Cauley was finally told that he'd been the only one to survive. I kept asking, "Are they alright?" And this guy just looked at me and said, "Well, son, you're the only one alive." Once he said that, I couldn't talk. It'd never been that way before in my life. I was shaking all over. Waiting at the airport in Milwaukee, Alexander eventually got word of the accident and arrived in Madison to find Cauley laid up in a hospital bed. He was in a total state of shock, says Alexander. He was just laying there with his eyes open. He didn't really know he was there at that point. In the wake of the accident, the entire Stax family was shaken to its core. The loss of Redding and the promising Bar-Kays was a devastating blow. As label co-founder Jim Stewart later put it, "The company was never the same to me after that." After months of shock and mourning, Cauley and Alexander decided to try and pick up the pieces of their shattered lives and reform the band. "A lot of our fellow musicians cared about the Bar-Kays," says Cauley. "A lot of them was crazy about us, and they helped us put the band back together." Debuting in 1968, the reconstituted Bar-Kays were a successful group, recording and playing sessions at Stax and frequently heading out on tour with groups like The Temptations. But, Cauley, who had a growing family, left the band in 1972. He didn't feel comfortable being gone on the road all the time, says Alexander, who continues to lead the Bar-Kays to this day. Despite the lingering scars of his past, Cauley continued to work and perform. His horn in demand for sessions in Memphis, Muscle Shoals, even Nashville. As the years passed, there was more sadness at Stax. The company went bankrupt in 1975, and in 1989 they bulldozed the studio. That day, Cauley stood outside playing a requiem on his trumpet. And that year, Cauley faced another brush with death when he suffered an aneurysm and massive stroke. I went to the hospital. They had this metal going through his entire skull holding his head up," says David Porter. They had given him 3 days to live after his stroke, says Cauley's daughter Chekita. But, as if scripted, on that third day, Cauley recovered dramatically enough to leave the intensive care unit. Still, he had to do total rehabilitation, she says, learning how to read, write, walk, dress himself, feed himself, all from scratch. They told him never play the trumpet again. On Cauley's first day home after months of rehab, he saw his trumpet lying on the couch. "Honestly, I didn't even know what it was. But I went over and picked it up and started playing, ba-da-dum-dum, says Cauley, aping the first notes of Soulfinger. In the difficult aftermath of his stroke, Cauley's musical future seemed limited. He still wanted to perform but was not mobile enough to do a lot of touring, says Porter, who set up Cauley gigging as a kind of one-man band, at his Da Blues restaurant inside the Memphis International Airport. Porter credits the popularity of Cauley's performances there with helping make the airport's later musical makeover possible. "In my mind, Ben's success was a big reason why there was no hesitation in not only incorporating music in the airport, but building the whole airport around the credibility of Memphis music." These days, Cauley has recovered almost fully from his stroke. The only reminder is some occasional difficulty with his speech. In recent years has become an important presence at the Stax Museum of American Soul, both at ceremonial functions and its school for children. This year has been one of significant anniversaries for Cauley, the 40th anniversary of the plane crash, the 50th of Stax's founding, and his own 60th birthday, which his family, which includes 7 children from a pair of marriages, celebrated by throwing a surprise party for him in October. This past Monday, with the anniversary of the crash approaching, Cauley did something he long promised himself to do. He returned to Madison, to the site of the crash. There he performed as part of a ceremony honoring Redding and the fallen Bar-Kays at the Monona Terrace, on the banks of the lake. Dressed in a black suit, Cauley spoke of how he was honored to be there to remember his friends. He then played some trumpet and sang elegiac renditions of Redding's "Try a Little Tenderness" and "Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay." Several hundred people came and listened, and bathed him in appreciative applause. In a way, the experience seems to have been a catharsis, providing Cauley some measure of peace. "Lord knows, it just really touched me to be there. You know, for a long time I used to tell my kids, one day I'm going back. I just had to see the lake," says Cauley softly, his voice trailing off. "I had to see it." Originally published December 9, 2007.